Welcome to Global Optimum, the podcast dedicated to making you a more effective altruist. I am Daniel Gambacorta. We're going to start off today with a groaner. How is effective altruism different in Soviet Russia? In Soviet Russia, altruism affects you. This episode will feature two segments: Apply Psychology, in which I will discuss mistakes, failure, and quitting, and Check This Rec, in which I'll provide you with a recommendation of a book, article, podcast that perhaps you are not familiar with. Let's get into it. Are you making enough mistakes? Are you failing enough? Are you giving up as much as you should? This segment is going to be all about mishaps, blunders, errors, oversights, gaffes, faux pas, slip-ups, screw-ups, goof-ups, and all the other ways we mess up. I mostly have in mind ambitious endeavors like completing difficult projects, getting advanced degrees, and having a successful career in a competitive field. I'm going to talk about how failure fits into EA culture, how to evaluate your chance of failure, how to fail better, how to learn from mistakes, and techniques for failing the exact optimal amount. If you never fail, that's probably a failure in itself. I'll get to that later. First, I'll talk about failure tolerance in EA. Generally speaking, competent people make fewer mistakes, and we want to look competent, so there's an incentive to hide mistakes. This plays out pretty plainly in social life. People disproportionately brag or humble brag about their successes and avoid mentioning failures. Justified or not, there's a stigma associated with failing at ambitious projects. It seems like we should want the culture of effective altruism to be rather different than the wider culture regarding mistakes and failure. We're all on the same team here. We have very similar goals. We want people to maximize the amount of good they are doing. It seems plausible that the very best EA projects are much more impactful than the average EA project. Given the distribution of altruistic impact, it seems like we generally want people to be willing to take big swings and aim to do something extraordinary. The thing about trying to do extraordinary things is they often fail. It's hard to change the world. So we might want to be more tolerant of failure than we might otherwise typically be. We also want to communicate failure more often compared to the wider culture. Knowing that a project failed is informative. It would be pretty silly if we duplicated each other's mistakes because those mistakes were never communicated. So overall, it seems like we would want a culture that is fairly failure tolerant. It does seem like there have been efforts to encourage failure tolerance. At the 2017 Effective Altruism Global in San Francisco, there was a panel discussion dedicated to celebrating failed projects and discussing why particular projects failed. There are other discussions of failed EA projects online. 80,000 Hours has a mistakes page on their site where they publicly discuss their mistakes. Likewise, Slate Star Codex has a mistakes page. I don't live in an EA hub, and I don't work at an EA org, so I am not at all plugged into what EA culture is like on the ground. I can't make any comments about the culture on the margin. Just saying, it seems good for EA to be more failure tolerant than the wider culture. And in the spirit of the point I'm making, I'll mention some of my EA failures. I applied to work at 2 EA organizations and didn't get either position. For a while, I was doing creativity research for explicitly EA reasons with the goal of having a brilliant breakthrough, but I did not have a brilliant breakthrough, so I gave up. I've started 2 EA meetups, both of which never got off the ground due to there being basically no EA presence in the cities I was in. I think some of these failures are good examples of failures that are not mistakes. One EA position I applied to, I was not qualified for, but I applied anyway because it didn't take much time. I'm not surprised I didn't get the position, but upon reflection, it doesn't seem like applying was a mistake. Likewise, when I've started EA meetups, I literally just created a group on meetup.com and hosted one event to see if there was any demand. I did it as a fast experiment that I'd be able to learn from. In retrospect, this doesn't seem like a mistake either. The groups didn't go anywhere, but that doesn't really surprise me, and I didn't invest much time. As for the creativity research, that was probably a mistake. I should have reflected more on the fact that people have been thinking about creativity for a long time. There are thousands of books and papers on the topic, and therefore it should be expected to be pretty damn hard to have a breakthrough. Next, I'm going to talk about how to evaluate your chance of success at some endeavor. First off, look at the base rate. For the love of Moloch, look at the base rate. If you are trying to get a PhD or get some job or start a business, at least do a little bit of research to find out what the base rate of success is. In a previous episode of this podcast titled, Should You Go to Graduate School?, I went over the base rates for getting a tenure track academic position in various fields. For example, only 59% of biology PhD students graduate within 10 years, and only 5% of those who graduate get a tenure track appointment within 3 years of graduating. That is something worth knowing if you want to go into biology. In my own life, there's instances where I definitely would have been better off if I put some effort into looking into the base rate of success. For example, I wasn't aware of how competitive academic jobs were when I first started applying, and I was definitely over-optimistic. I could have spent a few hours looking into how competitive the job market was, but I just didn't, which was dumb. So the first mistake is to ignore the base rate. The second mistake is to take the base rate literally and be so modest that you decide you are never allowed to do anything extraordinary. You are allowed to think that you are an extraordinary person, that you know secrets that other people don't, and that you really are more competent than the other people in whatever reference class you've placed yourself in. You've studied rationality, you know about overconfidence and all that, and after taking that into account, you are allowed to think you are special. There really are special people, and you might be one of them. Probably not, but if you have evidence of being special, you shouldn't ignore it because we have to use the outside view, and we aren't allowed to change the world because the average person doesn't change the world. Podfade is a term used in podcasting. It refers to the fact that most podcasts quickly fade out and die. I started this podcast about a year ago. At that time, there were about 540,000 podcasts. If you look at a 3-month slice in 2018, only about 20% of podcasts released a new episode in that time period. Something like 75% of podcasts that were started are no longer in production, with many podcasts fading by their 7th episode. These numbers require some interpretation, but suffice it to say, most podcasts die off pretty quickly. You may notice, dear listener, that This very podcast that you are listening to has not faded. Global optimum is alive and kicking. I've beaten the odds, and the fact that I've beaten the odds does not surprise me. And it's something that was predictable in retrospect. When evaluating my chance of Podfade, I'm allowed to update based on my track record of sticking to difficult things and finishing them. I'm allowed to notice that I have very different goals than many podcasters, that I'm not trying to maximize listenership or turn this into a business. The fact that this is still going a year later is better than average, but not unpredictable. We're allowed to actually be better than average. Next, I'll mention some other considerations to take into account when judging whether you should start or continue to pursue some ambitious endeavor. These are things to think about when evaluating your chance of success. If you look for advice or feedback from others, consider that it may be overly positive and encouraging. If you ask a professor whether they think you have what it takes to be a researcher, they likely won't be completely honest with you. They don't want to be mean, so they will probably be more encouraging than they actually think is justified. If negative feedback could involve hurting your feelings, you aren't going to get as much negative feedback as you would otherwise. If you are already well known, then of course, the haters will come out of the woodwork and you'll get excessively negative feedback. But in general, if you ask someone if you could hack it or if your project is a good project, they are more likely to be too positive than too negative. I have this experience with the podcast. The podcast is not famous, so I don't get any of the excessively negative feedback. I mostly get positive feedback. If people don't like the podcast, they just won't listen to it. And even if they have negative things to say, they'll keep it to themselves. Given that honest feedback is useful, what can be done about this? In my case, I have an assistant who I pay to help me out with various things. And one thing I pay them to do is give me feedback on the podcast. And I specifically go out of my way to ask for negative feedback. This method doesn't guarantee honest feedback, but seems at least worth doing in conjunction with getting feedback from people who I am not paying. Another way to get more honest feedback is to allow people to give their feedback anonymously. For this podcast, I'll probably make a survey in the near future and ask listeners to complete it. As another example, in Toastmasters, which is a public speaking club, after a speech is given, it's common for all club members to write their comments on a slip of paper. Those slips of paper are then collected and given to the speaker. That way, everyone is able to give their evaluation and critique of a speech, at least somewhat anonymously. Another thing to consider regarding advice and feedback is if you only speak to people who have succeeded at some endeavor, they have the job you want, they got good at the thing you want to get good at, there's going to be survivorship bias going on. The path they walked worked for them, and it might only have worked for them because it was an unusually good fit or they had rare advantages. I think the people who succeed at a thing are generally overly positive about how well it would work out for other people. It's also true that whenever you get deep into some field, you get to see all the bad parts that aren't noticeable from the outside. That can make people excessively cynical about their particular field because they only see the hidden bad parts of their field and not the hidden bad parts of other fields. But still, overall, I think the winners in a given field are too optimistic about how good a choice it would be for other people. I recently read a book on improv comedy, and the author talked about how he had many moments where he thought about giving up, but didn't. And his lesson for readers is to not give up. Don't give up is good advice if you're the kind of person who can succeed at the endeavor, but bad advice if you are not. If you aren't that funny, then you may well be better off giving up improv comedy and spending your time on other things. You don't have to spend 10,000 hours on every little thing that catches your attention. You should give up sometimes because your time is better spent on something else. Along the same lines, consider that your intuitive sense of how likely success is may be influenced by the fact that we are predominantly exposed to winners. Lottery winners get attention. You can hear about their stories, but you don't get a proportional amount of exposure to the millions of people who didn't win the lottery. It's easy to call attention to the winners, and that's probably part of the reason why the lottery is so popular. If you had to spend an equal amount of time thinking about every single person who lost the lottery, there might not be as much of an intuitive appeal, a sense that you could be the winner. Likewise, we see people who succeeded at getting into the NBA or succeeded at becoming a famous actor or whatnot. We don't see the many thousands of people who failed. So our sense of what our chances of success are may be biased by this biased exposure. In addition, you should consider the signaling incentives that come into play when you ask for advice and feedback. Winners are the people for whom persistence paid off. We want to come off as winners or potential winners, so to sound high status and optimistic, we may be biased towards giving the kind of advice that works out for high status people. This is similar to how you'll hear the advice to follow your dreams or never settle. Follow your dreams works out well if you are especially talented and have lots of advantages, and doesn't work out well otherwise. But we want to seem like the kind of people who follow our dreams because that's what the high status people did. And so we give the advice to others to follow their dreams. Signaling incentives bias advice towards being more encouraging of ambition and risk-taking. Finally, consider that the person giving you advice or feedback may stand to benefit from you having inaccurate beliefs. This doesn't necessarily mean that they are purposely misleading you, but without realizing it, they may nudge you towards beliefs that happen to advance their interests. For example, in graduate school, you work under an advisor, you spend some of your time advancing your advisor's research agenda. You are probably doing things that will help your advisor rack up publications and advance up the academic status hierarchy. So, your advisor wants you to be motivated and work hard. They therefore may avoid mentioning true things that may be discouraging, like your chance of graduating or your chance of getting a tenure track position. More generally, if someone stands to benefit from your work, they may put stars in your eyes to get you to work harder. So the advice you get might be biased if it's coming from someone who has a vested interest in whether you think you will succeed. Next, I'm going to talk about how to fail better. The first and most basic and most standard lesson is to fail fast. Find some quick, inexpensive way to test out what you are doing and get rapid feedback. If you have already spent time sitting around and thinking, you may learn a lot more by just testing your idea and giving it a go rather than continuing to sit around and ponder. Reality is complicated. We systematically underestimate its complexity. So you have to just bang your idea against reality and see what happens. You can't theorize your way to a perfect project, and the time you spend trying to perfect something could easily be wasted because you were way off about something. I'll give an effective altruist example of this principle. In the book Inadequate Equilibria by Eliezer Yudkowsky, he discusses a disagreement between himself and his collaborator Anna Salomon. Yudkowsky and Salomon were figuring out how to teach rationality skills to others, in this particular case, how to avoid the sunk cost fallacy. Yudkowsky thought he should write a script and give it to local leaders of rationality meetup groups. Those leaders could then use the script to teach their group members. Salomon thought they should just rustle together a few volunteers and improvise a teaching session on sunk costs to see what happens. Yudkowsky decided to go ahead and write the script, which took 2 months. Upon testing out the script at a local meetup, he discovered the script did not work. He says by his standards, it was a miserable failure. Here's what Yudkowsky learned from the experience. Quote, "The lesson I learned is to not carefully craft anything that it was possible to literally just improvise and test immediately in its improvised version, ever. Even if the minimum improvisable product won't be representative of the real version. Even if you already expect the current version to fail, you don't know what you'll learn from trying the improvised version." End quote. By sheer coincidence, I'm next going to talk about the sunk cost fallacy because it's one of the main reasons why people don't fail fast enough. The sunk cost fallacy is a cognitive bias. I discussed it in a previous episode of the podcast titled The Personality of Effective Altruists, Part 1. As a refresher, I'll present a scenario that demonstrates the sunk cost fallacy. Imagine you buy a ticket to see a play, and the ticket costs you $50. You then buy a ticket to see an opera, and that ticket costs you $100. After buying these tickets, you realize both performances are happening on the same night. Your tickets are non-refundable, and you can only go to one of them. Your best guess is that you will enjoy the play more than the opera. Which do you go to? To reiterate, the play ticket was $50, and you think you will enjoy the play more, whereas the opera ticket was $100. Take a second to think about it. Okay, it can be argued that the rational decision is to go to the play. The money that you spent on tickets is gone. It's in the past. There's no way you can get it back. We call the cost of the tickets a sunk cost. You shouldn't make decisions about the future based on sunk costs. If you think you will like the play more, you should go to the play. It doesn't matter how much more money you spent on the opera tickets, that money is gone. In spite of these arguments I'm making for ignoring sunk costs, it has been found that people very much take sunk costs into account in a way that seems irrational. When your judgments are irrationally influenced by sunk costs, you are said to be suffering from the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy can cause us to persist at endeavors that we really should give up on. If we've already put time and money into something, it can be hard to let it go. For example, if you've already spent years in grad school, that fact by itself shouldn't be taken as an argument for persisting. It may be wise to continue because the benefits outweigh the costs, but the time you put in already is not a separate line on the balance sheet. If a better opportunity comes around, you shouldn't shy away from it just because you've already spent time doing something else. So what can be done about this? One strategy is to, before you embark on some ambitious project, decide the conditions under which you will quit. Come up with some objective metric. For example, if my business isn't making X amount of money in 1 year, I'll take that as strong evidence that I should quit. Or if I'm not getting X amount of traffic to my blog in 6 months, I'll take that as strong evidence that I should quit. The caveat here is when you start some ambitious project, there are probably a bunch of unknown unknowns, and it might be hard to come up with a metric that makes sense when you come up with it and still makes sense in the future. That said, it seems like this can be better than nothing. Next, I'll talk about project selection. One criterion for selecting projects, among many, is how well they fail. All else equal, it's better to pursue a project that fails well. I'll talk about some of the factors that go into whether a project fails well. First, if your project fails, how does that affect your option value? In this case, option value refers to retaining the opportunity to pursue other projects, even if you think it's unlikely you will do so. In general, it's good to have options and not cut yourself off from future opportunities, even if they seem unlikely to be useful now. I think it's plausible that we underweight option value on average. We tend to underestimate how much we will change throughout time, a bias known as the end of history illusion, and I think we might generally put too much stock into whatever we happen to be doing right now. I think options are more valuable than we think they are. Projects that retain option value upon failure are, all else equal, superior to projects that don't. For example, say you are an academic and you are deciding between some project that you can work on from within academia, like research, and some project that involves leaving academia, like, say, starting a nonprofit. A commonly discussed feature of academia, and I'm sure it varies by field, but it is said that if you leave academia, it is quite hard to get back in. Once you leave, the door closes behind you. So the project that involves leaving academia reduces option value. It'll be harder to pursue projects within academia afterwards. In contrast, the project that involves staying in academia maintains option value. You can still go ahead and start a nonprofit in the future. Second, if your project fails, will having worked on the project help you develop skills, build your status, make connections, etc.? Will you walk away from this failed project with transferable benefits? If your project will somehow make you stronger, even if the project fails, that's a bonus, all else equal. And third, will an incomplete version of your project still be valuable? Some projects are quite incremental, whereas for others, there's a severe threshold. For example, say you want to write a brilliant and influential blog, which you figure will take years to reach its potential. Doing 6 months of blogging may be better than no blogging, even if you ultimately decide that spending years blogging is not the best use of your time. In contrast, if you pursue a PhD and quit partway through, a partial PhD is worth very little. The vast majority of the value comes on the day you graduate, and getting 99% of a PhD isn't worth much. So if your project is useful, even if not executed to its full potential, that's a bonus, all else equal. Next, I'll talk about how to learn from mistakes. Say you make a mistake. You reflect on it, and you come up with a general solution, a way to avoid the mistake in the future. One issue that can come up is the next time you have the opportunity to make the mistake, you don't remember to implement your solution. Here's a mundane example from my life. I want to avoid drinking a lot of water at night because then I'll wake up in the middle of the night and then that can cause me to sleep worse. My solution is to avoid spicy food for dinner because if I eat spicy food, I have to drink a lot of water with it. That solution works, but 1 month after I think of it, I'm at a restaurant, I don't remember, I'm not supposed to have spicy food, I order spicy food, drink too much water, and sleep worse. We repeat the same mistakes because we just don't remember to implement the solution. So how does one deal with this, assuming it's worth putting forth a little bit of effort? I can tell you what I do. I will somehow make the solution habitual, something I do consistently, and or I will remind myself of the solution periodically. Here's another real-life example. My PhD took 1 year longer to get than it should have. The extra year was largely due to political issues, and these political issues were to some extent my fault. Having grad school take an extra year is generally very bad because for that year, I was losing money, whereas I could have been making money. Factoring in opportunity cost, I lost well over $50,000, so this was not a small mistake on my part. I reflected on how I paid basically no attention to workplace politics. I read up on the topic, and I thought about how I could do it better. I also came up with a habitual solution. Every Sunday, I plan my week, and I think about goals in different areas of my life that I'm focusing on. I added politics as one of these focus areas, so once a week, I would schedule time to think about workplace politics and what strategies I could implement to play politics better. Instead of just thinking about the problem once and hoping I remembered solutions, I scheduled time to think about the problem each week. Of course, this is overkill for lots of mistakes, but given the gravity of the mistake I made and the general usefulness of understanding workplace politics, I think it was appropriate. Here's something else I do. I have a list of various rules and habits I tried to follow, things like diet and productivity and sleep habits. I will read that list once a week as a reminder. Also, part of my morning routine is to write down any mistakes I made the previous day. I take maybe 30 seconds to type into my phone whether I went to bed on time or followed my diet or whatnot. So I'm getting some repetition of thinking about this habit I tried to follow and failed to. Then on Sunday, I'll read through the mistakes I made that week as another reminder and think about whether I have to change anything. For me, this is all very fast and routinized. It's not like this is taking up a lot of mental bandwidth. My best guess is that I get a small net benefit by doing this. Next, I'll talk about some difficulties associated with learning from mistakes and failures. First, it can be hard to learn much from a sample size of one. If you try one time to do some difficult, ambitious thing and fail, it could be that you basically did everything right, but got unlucky. We tend to underestimate the role of luck in understanding why things played out the way they did. It could be that you were talented enough, and if luck swung your way, you would have succeeded, but it just didn't. Also, your failures may be overdetermined, and understanding only some of the factors that caused your failure might not be that useful. If you think your project failed due to X, but really X, Y, and Z could all have independently caused your failure. So in your next project, you make sure to avoid X, but then you get killed by Y and or Z. There are some biases to consider when it comes to learning from failure. Hindsight bias makes us feel like events were more foreseeable and inevitable than they really were. When we already know the outcome seems more obvious to us than it would have seemed if we didn't know the outcome. When reflecting on the failures of others, it can seem oh so obvious that their decisions were destined to lead to failure. Once you already know the outcome, it's a little too easy to feel like you would have been able to predict it, that if you were in the other person's shoes, you would have known better because their decision was obviously bad. When it comes to understanding the behavior of others, and even more generally, events that are out of our control, hindsight bias can be a factor. However, when we ourselves fail, self-serving bias can cause us to perceive less foreseeability than there really was. Self-serving bias refers to the observation that when we perform well, we are quick to take the credit, but when we perform poorly, we are quick to point to situational factors. We find ways of locating the blame for poor performance outside of ourselves. When we fail, we're biased towards feeling like the failure was unforeseeable, that it came out of nowhere, nobody could have seen it coming. The failure was caused by some external force, and I can't really be blamed for it. When you screw up, you probably deserve more blame than you actually give yourself on average, assuming the failure is to some degree public, so you have a signaling incentive to cast your failure in a positive light. Yes, of course, some people blame themselves excessively for their own failures, and many of us take too much blame some of the time, but on average, we don't give ourselves enough credit for our failures. It's rare for someone to, without caveat, just admit they messed up. I talked about self-serving bias on a previous episode of the podcast titled Why Are We Biased? Part 2. For my final topic this segment, I'll go into some particular techniques related to mistakes and failure. First, the premortem. This is also referred to as prospective hindsight. It's very similar to the rationalist technique Murphy-Jitsu. You conduct a premortem before embarking on some project. The premortem entails imagining the project has failed. You know with certainty the project has failed. Now, from this vantage point, come up with reasons why it failed. When performed in a group setting, every member of the group writes down reasons why the project failed, which are then read aloud. The purpose of the premortem is to come up with plausible ways your project could fail that you haven't thought of so that you can improve the plan. The experimental evidence in favor of using this technique is pretty sparse, but anecdotally, it seems to be useful. In a group setting, it could tweak incentives in productive ways. When getting a project off the ground, group members might not want to look like a downer by talking about potential issues, or they don't want to look disloyal, or they don't want to disturb the harmony of the group. If everybody has to come up with reasons for failure and read them out loud, now, if anything, you're incentivized to want to look clever by coming up with plausible reasons. The premortem has also been recommended for use by individuals. It's not totally clear to me what advantages this would have beyond just thinking about how you might fail, but there might be something psychologically interesting going on when you put yourself in a place of already knowing the outcome. And this is very cheap to implement, so I'd say it's worth experimenting with. The second technique I shall speak of, which is sort of a technique but really just a principle, is the umeishism. The term umeishism was coined by the computer scientist Scott Aaronson. Umeishisms are meant to refer to the kind of thing Aaronson's PhD advisor would say. Umeishisms are best explained with examples, so here are some umeishisms. If you never miss a flight, you are spending too much time at airports. If you've never been rejected, you're not asking enough. If you can't remember any time in the last 6 months when you failed, you aren't trying to do difficult enough things. The basic format of an umeishism is if on some decision spectrum you rarely find yourself going too far in one direction, you may be going too far in the other direction. The wisdom of umeishisms are subsumed by the more general principle that we should seek to err in both directions. When making decisions that lie along a spectrum, we should choose so that we have some chance of being off from the best choice in both directions. If you're deciding whether to ask for a raise, you should feel like there is some chance you are asking too soon and some chance you have waited too long. Ideally, when deciding how ambitious to be, we should be left with some sense that we might be being too ambitious and we might not be ambitious enough. We should reflect on how often we make mistakes and fail. If we find ourselves to be fairly perfect, that might indicate we aren't actualizing our potential. If you're actually aiming to be as strong as you could be, you would occasionally overreach and fail. So consider whether you are making enough mistakes and failing enough. You should probably be failing sometimes, as it indicates you are pushing your boundaries. To add the necessary caveats, this principle is not saying you should have an equal probability of erring in either direction. You, of course, want to consider the magnitude of the gains and losses at stake. You shouldn't have an equal probability of being late or early for a job interview, for example. The thought is rather, all things considered, you should think you could be making a mistake in either direction. Also, sometimes the best decision is already at the extreme end of a spectrum. For example, it would be silly to say, if you never go to jail, you aren't committing enough armed robberies. You may reasonably feel that 0 armed robberies is, indeed, the ideal number of robberies to commit. If you'd like to see a proof of the basic principle I've been discussing, I've included a link in the show notes to the article titled Why We Should Err in Both Directions by Owen Cotton Barrett. In the article, he mentions a few ways to apply the principle to thinking about priority setting in effective altruism. I think these are pretty useful, so I'm going to read them verbatim. Quote, "You should spend enough time and resources on the prioritization itself that you think some of the time may have been wasted. For example, you should spend a while at the end without changing your mind much, but not so much that you are totally confident you have the right answer. If you are unsure what discount rate to use, you should choose one so that you think it could be either too high or too low. If you don't know how strongly to weigh fragile cost-effectiveness estimates against more robust evidence, you should choose a level so that you might be over or underweighing them. When you are providing a best guess estimate, you should choose a figure which plausibly could be wrong either way. Suppose you've made lots of grants. Then, if you've never backed a project which has failed, you're probably too risk-averse in your grant making." End quote. All right, that concludes my discussion of mistakes, failure, and quitting. I've mentioned some of my mistakes throughout the episode to do my part in destigmatizing failure. Even though we all fail sometimes, there's social pressure to never admit it, which seems like a pretty bad equilibrium. I hope you feel like you might be too much of a failure, but also maybe not enough of a failure. May you occupy the Goldilocks zone of failure. For now, let's fail on over to check this rec. In this segment, I recommend some bit of media that you are perhaps unfamiliar with. This episode's rec is a podcast. The podcast is titled Philosophical Disquisitions. It is an interview podcast hosted by John Danaher, who is a lecturer at the National University of Ireland. Danaher talks to other academics about futurism, philosophy, and technology. Interviewees include Anders Sandberg, Seth Baum, and Roman Yampolsky. To get you started, I will recommend a particular episode. I recommend you check out episode 44, Fleischman on evolutionary psychology and sex robots. Danaher speaks to evolutionary psychologist Diana Fleischman about our sex bot future. Will the rising costs of courtship drive men into the arms of sex bots? Can sex bots be used as treatment for dangerous men? How will sex bots influence women's sexual behavior? If you want to know the answers to these questions, and you have a sec, check this rec. That's it for this episode. The sources that I've referred to throughout the episode, including this week's rec, can be found in the show notes. This podcast is an effective altruist project. If you aren't familiar with effective altruism and you would like to learn more, I would recommend visiting effectivealtruism.org. Now, go forth and make history.